how important is for you the show, the big picture science? Are you 100% committed to this show?
No, I do many other things. The show consumes about, it's something I do as well as my regular job, and my regular job involves lots of different things. Obviously, studying the science, thinking about the science, but also I do a lot of writing and speaking and books and stuff like that. I like to talk to people. They don't necessarily like to listen, but I do like to talk to them. A lot of the actual work in SETI these days is simply finding the money. And that's not very interesting for listeners, so I won't say anything more about that, but that is the problem.
How do you build the show?
To begin with, you have to have the idea. What is the show going to be about? But more than an idea, we try and make sure that there's a storyline for every show. So you say, all right, well, what's the story there? What's the story? How would you like to get into that? And you could just have 3 people talking about why the public's afraid of vaccines, but that would just be 3 stories. I mean, if you could take the show and chop it in the middle and flip the 2 halves, and it would still be the same, essentially, then you don't have very much structure in the show. So, I think it's good to have structure where you maybe the first third of the show, you talk about, well, who are these people, that don't want vaccines, right? Part 2 is somebody who comes back and say, well, actually, that's not true. And this is why we know it's not true. Then then the third part of the story is, well, what do you do about this? Any interview that's longer than 7 minutes better be really exceptional. Otherwise, the audience, they just turn you off and they go and get a double latte at Starbucks or something.
Or
right?
a double vodka?
Double vodka. It's hard to keep people's interest. What we do is, of course, having various people we're talking to, a storyline, and also humor. Certain parts of the show are scripted. The interviews are not scripted. I mean, you write out some questions, but obviously it's not scripted. You don't know what the person at the other end is going to say. That's what it's all about, which means you need to understand, you need to know the material well enough that you know what the right questions are, right? I mean, if it's in science, you need to know enough about the topic so that well, what's going on here? Why is this interesting? Why is this important? You need to know enough about the subject to ask the right questions. And again, if there's controversy, that always helps.
So a lot has changed in communication since you joined the show in 2002.
Well, obviously, the show has evolved in terms of the technology, right? And in particular, I mean, clearly digital audio technology is the way you do it today. But I think that maybe the most interesting things have been the refinement of the storytelling.
Is it more about what the audience wants to listen or what you want the audience to listen to?
Well, I hope they're not all that different, but in the end,
they are.
Yeah, well, sometimes they are. I mean, if the audience wants to listen to something, I mean, the audience writes us all the time, and we get emails every day from listeners, so we get some idea of what some of them want to listen to. And there's some topics that, they find more interesting than others. I want them to understand some of the science. That's my first concern, that they understand not only the facts of a particular line of research, there's that, but also, the methods of science.
Seth, how would you describe your audience? Who is listening to your program?
Well, we don't really know. I mean, remember that we're both a podcast and a broadcast. All we know about the podcast is how many people download this show. So we have sort of a number, and we also get some information about where they are. All we know is something about the people who write us.
Generally, feedback is positive or negative?
Most of the feedback we get is positive, actually. Love the show. And I'm glad that they love the show. But, it's the people who say, in your last show, you said this, and either that's not true, or it was naive, or it was biased. That in some ways is more useful,
yes.
Believe it or not.
And by the way,
not always pleasant, though.
No, but useful. What are the topics that they generate this sort of feedbacks?
Well, we try to be edgy in the show. This is a fight I have with the producer all the time and my co-host, Molly, because she doesn't like to say anything that might offend anyone. But I respond to this by saying, Molly, if we're not offending anybody, then the show isn't very interesting, right? And so if you get feedback when somebody says, your show was so terrible, I want my 1 hour back. You owe me an hour. All right, whatever. What am I going to say? That's the kind of feedback that shows that at least the topic was interesting because it was, controversial. If it's not controversial, then maybe what you have is an infomercial, right? You're just giving this information and, that's okay. But that will not widen your audience. You won't reach a lot of people. And in particular, you won't reach the kind of people you probably ought to reach, which are not the people who already know some science, but people who don't know any science. Given that we have to raise the money for the show itself, the more listeners there are, the easier it is for us to raise the money. That's a fact. And, if you don't care about the number of listeners, then maybe you don't even care very much about the show. So that is something. But that's not the goal of the show. The goal isn't to say, wow, we're going to get this number of listeners and then we can die happy, right? The idea is to be successful in interesting people in science.
What do we do with all the shows that are recorded? Why do we keep them?
Because hard disk space is cheap. That's why.
Do you study at all the chronological order of the guests in the show, or your horizon is just 1 or 2 weeks down the road?
It is largely contingency. I mean, in general, science it's news, right? It's not so predictable. And as a consequence, we have meetings every week and we say, okay, what are the interesting stories that we should be addressing? What's happened in the world of science that's, not just technically interesting, but has some, effect on Mr. and Mrs. Front Porch there in downtown Houston.
And do your guests ever know the questions in advance?
Generally, no. Maybe 2% of them will ask for the questions, and we try not to do that.
And so if that is true, how much sharing happens before the microphone is on?
Very little. We'll talk to you for 20 minutes on this date at this time, and we hope you'll be interesting.
Seth, why do we have a problem with our bright minds in academia? Why they cannot communicate properly?
Well, I mean, it's sort of like saying, yeah, why is it that these are obviously very bright people? Why is it that so many of them are bad dancers? I mean,
Nobody told them.
But it's kind of an orthogonal talent. It's not necessary for them to be interesting to get tenure.